Well, the basic reality was that 100 years after the Civil War, the Civil War's promise had remained unfulfilled. And equality in the eyes of the law was not a reality in large parts of the country. And it was very awkward for John Kennedy, even as the 61, 62 began to go on, there were all sorts of commemorations of the 100th anniversary of this aspect of the Civil War, the 100th anniversary of that. And when it came around for the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, he was very stymied as to what to do because he didn't want to ignore it, but he didn't want to make too big a deal about it either because it was all too clear that the promise of emancipation had not really been vindicated. It began to seem, partly to a generation of African Americans who had served, for example, in World War II, been in Europe and other places where they didn't experience that kind of Jim Crow discrimination. 15, 18 years later, it began to seem just completely untenable. And of course, then in the spring of 1963, all the demonstrations culminated. It started with the Freedom Rides in 1961, the integration of Old Miss, which turned into a horrible riot. And in the spring of 1963, Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and the other SCLC demonstrators had those incredible days in Birmingham where Bull Connor's fire hoses and police dogs were turned on young people and children, knocked them to the streets. And the world was outraged, and President Kennedy was outraged too. And you certainly don't see many examples of really political courage in confronting these questions. Or to put it another way, I mean, Bill McCulloch from Ohio, his district was 2.7% black. He just thought it was the right thing to do. The House Republican leader, Charlie Halleck of Indiana, had a similarly all-white district, and he realized his leadership of the caucus would be in jeopardy because he was seen as, imagine this, it's an election year. First of all, 63 running up to the election year, but then 1964 as an election year. And the Republican Party in Congress, instead of saying to President Johnson, oh, well, your problem is you have a bunch of hate-filled people in your party and you can't resolve this issue. You have large majorities in both houses, but it's your own fault you can't fix it. Don't blame us. We'll go to the polls and see which party the voters like better. Instead, they removed civil rights as an issue in the election effectively by cooperating to pass the bill.
It's hard to say because it's one of those time travel questions, right? I mean, part of where we are today is because of what the Civil Rights Act did. I mean, it helped rewrite congressional politics and helped rewrite the alignment of the parties. The South changed dramatically in part because, Southern politics changed in part because of that. So I think that, yeah, you probably would have had something, but it would have been much less strident, much less direct. One of the beauties of the Civil Rights Act is that while it's a very big bill and it covers a lot of ground, it's also very clear in what it covers, what it doesn't cover, how it drives enforcement, what the principles are behind it. I don't think you would have had anything like that today. Oh, it was incredibly successful. Strikingly. In the days after, Title II was the thing that everyone was really focused on because it had an immediate impact. Title VII was more or less kind of phased in, not entirely, but but Title II was this thing where the president signs the bill tonight, and tomorrow stores cannot discriminate against blacks. So this is going to be tested, and there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of fear that things would. That there would be violence, or there would be, on the part, of course, some people said it's going to be violence on the part of blacks, and others said, well, no, it's going to be white opposition, and they're going to beat people who try to integrate these stores. That did happen. There were cases across the South of violence against testers, largely what these the early integrationists were considered. But what's striking is how little there was, and by and large, the bill was. Title II was accepted. It's interesting to contrast it with Brown. Now, obviously, the Brown decision in '54, this is 10 years later, 10 years of change, but the Brown decision was violently opposed by the South. And the white citizens councils rose up through the 50s in organized opposition to Brown. And a large part of the argument against it was, this is the Supreme Court speaking. This is nine men in a room in Washington. They don't speak for the people. They don't speak for the federal government. Who are they to tell us what to do? Contrast that with what happened over the Civil Rights Act. This was a bill that came out of Congress, was overwhelmingly, in the end, supported by the House and strongly supported by the Senate. It was debated. It took a year to pass through from Kennedy's origination to Johnson's signing. It was covered in the media. It was debated everywhere. There is no question that this bill has the mandate of the elected government of the United States. There's a continuity and between the very first speech and the very last speech, and every speech he gives in between, and every press statement he gives, and every answer to every press conference, and every little speech he gives to the Florida Democratic Committee. Everything has an urgency not only to pass civil rights, but to do it without compromise. And he said this in private, too. He said to Humphrey, and he said to Dirksen, and he said to Mike Mansfield, the majority leader, I will not accept a compromise. We must be here till the very end. He's actually doing the opposite of what we think Lyndon Johnson does. He is not negotiating. He is not wheeling and dealing. He is saying the time for that has passed. We have to have a bill, and we have to have this bill. And it's amazing. It's something that you don't think politicians do. And yet, for him, he felt that moral urgency. He felt the absolute need to get this through. And yes, of course, he stood to reap huge political benefits for it. But I really do think that he was speaking from a moral and ethical center that maybe people didn't appreciate, that a lot of people don't appreciate today, but that really came through in those speeches, and I think was absolutely honest and was vital to the bill passing the way it did.
Well, we have a standard story that's represented by this center, actually, that during the first, there was a golden age. Giants walked the earth in the golden age. Madison and Lincoln and great men mobilized the American people to do great things. And then the 20th century is a disappointment. If you look at the constitutional amendments of the 20th century, they don't amount to much. Since the New Deal, the Constitution has been created by the judges. It's we the judges, the great judges from Brandeis and Holmes to Scalia and beyond. They are the ones who create the Constitution. This is wrong. Simply wrong. It's the civil rights revolution and the New Deal in which there is this broad, self-conscious, sustained, mobilized, thoughtful alternatives. Which way should we go on our constitutional future? These are much greater achievements of we the people. Mind you, in their time, that is, in their time of the 18th century and the 19th century, these also were great achievements, relatively speaking. Relatively speaking. But really, it's the 20th century in which we the people have elaborately spoken. The spirit of popular sovereignty lives today. It hasn't died in the great old days of the 19th century, when the Tea Party is mobilizing. I happen to be against the Tea Party. They are trying to reenact a generational drama of reconquering and transforming our constitutional future. Maybe it'll succeed, maybe they won't. But this is the spirit of popular sovereignty.